Welcome to What's Left, a weekly political discussion challenging the mainstream left. I'm Eduardo Abarca with Andy Lipson and our guest, Gay Adelmann. Sorry,
Hello.
my English. And our guest,
yes.
And our guest, Gay Adelmann.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Yes. So we are going to have a very interesting interview with you because this is a different perspective, as we were saying earlier. And but let's first introduce you. So I want Andy, you two have met first.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, Gay. You'll be saying more about yourself. But Gay is from Louisville, Kentucky, and I found out about her. She contacted me through Facebook because she had seen an interview of me while I was at the Oakland strike, one of the rally things. And some things I had said during that interview seems like it really resonated with you. And so you just reached out and you friended me. And then once you friended me on Facebook, I looked up the article that you had that was like a union hit piece on you. And I thought you were a teacher. And then I find out you're not a teacher, you're a parent supporting the strikes that are going on or the sick-outs that are going on in Kentucky. And then once I heard that the union was like running you down, then I knew you were somebody I could trust. So I was like, okay, I got to find out about this person. And we've just been kind of contacting each other. And she has a radio station of her own. She puts stuff out. So I was like, can we interview you and find out just what you've all been about and what you've done? So that started this.
So the topic will be centered around the Kentucky strikes, which you have been in support of, correct?
Correct.
Yeah. The recent Kentucky strike was sometime in February, yes? Can you please... Yes, I think it was, yes?
Yes, our first one was February 28th. We had six days that we were out of school this session.
So can you give us some background information on yourself and where you're from, what you do, and just any relative life experience of your own?
Ooh, okay. I am a parent of two boys. They both are public school graduates. We moved to Louisville, Kentucky in 2012, and my youngest was starting his freshman year in high school. So we did the usual looking around at schools and neighborhoods to try to decide where to live. And Jefferson County is the first place we've ever lived that was a district of choice. We are a public school district. We don't have charter schools, but we still have choice in the sense that you can live in one neighborhood and apply to a magnet or a traditional program all over the district, depending on your students' interests. And so that's what we did. We bought a house in an upscale, moderate to upscale neighborhood, and my son chose a magnet program called the Academy at Shawnee, which is an aviation magnet, and he actually got to fly planes and work towards his pilot's license. And it was an amazing experience for him. In fact, he's now at the U.S. Naval Academy. So he had tremendous leadership opportunities, tremendous opportunities to take AP classes and really build his resume, and did really well on high-stakes tests, and got into the U.S. Naval Academy, and he's doing great. So that school happens to be in the west part of Louisville, which is our urban, high minority, high poverty part of town, which is why they put the magnet program in that school, is to attract families like ours. So it worked. But it wasn't long before I realized that there was a perception of that part of town, and many people tried to discourage us from sending my son to attend school there, including a realtor who I ended up firing over the language that she used. She sent me houses and schools in a different part of town and said, this is a more acceptable option for you. And I wanted to know who she thought she was defining acceptable based on stereotypes. That really opened my eyes to what lay ahead in our public school experience and awakening. And So it wasn't until my son's first year, that summer, we had an amazing principal. He was a turnaround principal. In fact, his name is Keith Look. I encourage you to look him up because he has taught in Philadelphia and Baltimore. He's been a leader in those schools, a turnaround leader in those districts. And when we were able to get him at Shawnee, it was a major coup to have someone of such repute, is that the right word? Mm-hmm. Teaching and leading this turnaround of this high. It was considered a persistently low achieving school. It was a priority school. The state had come in and labeled us a failing school. And so, you get all of the stereotypes and hurdles and self-fulfilling prophecies essentially that come with such labeling. And after my son's first year there, they forced him to resign because he essentially hadn't solved poverty in the 3 or 4 years that he had been there. And we also have a very structural, our student assignment plan is structurally racist. And they basically take the students from that part of the community and bus them out to 12 different schools all around the district. And then in order to put students in the school where my son attended, they actually backfill from another part of town. And so once I started paying attention to the student assignment map and recognizing what it was doing to the communities that were basically having all of the burden of diversity placed on them. And these are families who often are working 2 or 3 jobs, who don't have reliable transportation, who maybe don't have literacy or English language proficiency, and we're forcing them to send their children further away from their homes. And if they have a sick child, they have to leave work and take 2 buses, and it becomes a huge burden on families that are already disenfranchised, instead of saying, what can we do? And that was kind of where I started, I guess, is wanting to know what the rest of the community could be doing to share some of this burden. And the more I tried to raise the map in public, the more attacks I started getting. But it was more than that. There were just signs. Now that I look back on it, there were signs that they knew the privatizers were coming. They knew that we were going to be facing charter schools in the near future. And so that it was easier for them to set these schools up as sacrificial lambs and leave them vulnerable to the predators, so that when charters come, they can protect their high-flying schools with their, the families that have the political and social capital that are able to get into those schools in the first place. And so, looking back on it, that's what we were fighting, although we didn't know that at the time. But just to summarize, we ended up forming our organization called Dear JCPS after about 2 years in, because we started to realize that this was going to be a pattern. We were going to be speaking at board meetings, and we were going to be contacting board members, and we were going to be sending out e-blasts, and we were going to be publishing anonymous letters, and needed a format and a platform to do that. And JCPS is the name of our district. It's Jefferson County Public Schools. And so another parent at Shawnee and I came up with the name Dear JCPS because it was like Dear John. We were breaking up with the district. And we had other parents and other teachers, especially teachers. That second year, as we headed into the fall and our principal had been forced to resign, there was no leadership in the building. And so the district has this requirement that they come in and they shake things up every 3 or 4 years if you haven't gotten out of your priority status. And so that was removing the principal and creating this turnaround plan, created a great deal of stress and trauma for our teachers and our students, because they've lived this year after year. There's all this excess scrutiny on this low performing school because of high stakes test scores, and what are you doing to bring up your scores? And that means cutting programs and cutting recess and shortening lunches and not actually doing anything that benefits the students themselves. It's abusive, and I know you know that, especially for these kids that are in trauma who don't even know where they're sleeping that night or where their next meal is going to come from, or saw their brother arrested or shot the night before. We have a lot of gun violence in this part of our community. And so, we needed to be focusing on trauma-informed care, but instead we were focusing on test scores. So when the turnaround proposal came out, the teachers came to us, the parents, because we were like the only adults in the building. There was no leader. The principal had been forced to resign, and we had just started a PTA the year before. So we kind of became this mouthpiece for teachers and parents who were afraid of retribution. And we actually witnessed retribution. Teachers would come and say, we tried this extended school day, which is one of the things they wanted to do this turnaround, and it didn't work. And instead of extended school day, why don't we do so-and-so? And then the next thing you know, that teacher was reassigned. So even just questioning what's best for students, even if you're not being rebellious or bucking the system, you still faced retribution. So we created this anonymous letter format so teachers and parents and students could submit letters to our board anonymously and protect themselves. And often we found that our board really wanted to make good decisions, but the administration was lying to them. And so we started trying to intervene in that process, in that timeline. So when we would see what was on the agenda for a certain board meeting, we would spend those next 2 or 3 days before the meeting itself actually took place and try to inform the community and say, this is what they're voting on. What are your concerns? And we would gather the concerns and present them to the board so that the board could make more informed decisions. And that worked. That helped. It didn't always. It wasn't perfect because there's obviously more things that you need to be fighting for than you have the bandwidth to do if you're a volunteer organization. And the administration adapted. So as soon as they realized what we were up to, then they would start being more covert with the information that they would provide, or lie to us, flat out lie to us. And we saw assistant superintendents who came out to our school for this particular proposal. In fact, made a presentation, made 3 separate presentations to community members to explain what they were planning, and the turnout was mostly negative, concern, feeling like we were being misled and manipulated and managed. In fact, those meetings were very controlled as to how you participated and what kinds of questions you could ask. And so then the board meeting came around, and that same assistant superintendent said, we held 3 community forums and everyone loved it. And we were like, what meeting was she at? So we started to recognize that these people couldn't be trusted, and started becoming more and more vocal, which put us in the crosshairs of some people who felt like, if we're rocking the boat, we're leaving the district vulnerable for state takeover, because that's always been a threat. We've always been rumored to be in fear of state takeover. And so that, of course, just causes you to act more short-term, not what's in, we're always living in fear. We're always sweeping things under the rug. That's been going on since 2013 when I first started getting involved in this, because they said that our school was in threat of being taken over. And so that was my first time I ever had heard that term. And as we got closer and closer to making a difference at the school level, we realized that our entire district was now being told that it was in threat of state takeover. And that actually plays out later in the timeline, where we actually did get our new governor appointed a new board, Kentucky Board of Education, who, as soon as those appointees were accepted, the very next day they forced out our good commissioner, our highly qualified commissioner, and replaced him with a charter school, the architect behind the charter school bill, who also wrote his dissertation on charter schools. And the audit that had already taken place under the former commissioner was doctored to say that a state takeover was recommended as the result of this audit, even though the audit had been conducted under the former commissioner but released under the new commissioner. And all of this took place under other individuals whose names appear on formation documents tied to charter schools, tied to scholarship tax credits, These are individuals that have been working behind the scenes to put themselves in positions to benefit from the privatization, and now they are also serving on the board, making these decisions and self-dealing these outcomes. So I started in 2013, so it's been about 6 years that I've been doing this work. And at the district level, some of the successes we've had, once we started realizing that our superintendent was lying to us and covering things up and a big part of the problem, we started asking our board members to replace her. And when they refused, and in fact, when the chairman of the board pushed her renewal through in a very shady board meeting, we realized that he was definitely part of the problem. And so we pushed to get him and other board members removed. Later, it turns out he was part of an organization called Scala. He still is part of an organization called Scala, which is the steering committee to advance the Louisville agenda, I think is what that stands for. And it's basically a local version of ALEC. So we have our own, and it's not even the same party. Like ALEC is the American Legislative Exchange Council that has been writing the privatization legislation across the country. Yes, so Scala, ALEC here is really involved. Americans for Prosperity is really involved. The Koch brothers are really involved ever since 2016 elections. We lost the House to a Republican supermajority. So we now have House, Senate, and Republican governors who are all pushing a privatization agenda. But at the local level, at the Louisville level, it's more of the neoliberals. It's our Democrats that are pushing this privatization agenda. So it's an interesting combination. But that board member was tied to Scala. So we had always thought that he was pushing a privatization agenda. He would hint at, bringing in outside management organizations to run these failing schools, quote unquote failing schools. But then when he pushed the renewal of our superintendent, despite all of the evidence that she needed to go, we knew he needed to be voted out. And so we started recruiting candidates to run. And then another candidate came out of the dark money world and was running against another board member that we really liked. So we also fought to keep him from getting elected. A ton of money went behind him, and we still were able to stop that. And then once we got new board members in place, they were able to remove our superintendent, even though her contract wasn't up. And one of the things that we did, our organization held a rally asking for her to resign, because we couldn't ask for her to be fired because she had a 4-year contract. But we put a lot of pressure on her to resign, and with 2 years left, she actually did. So those are some local successes that we experienced. And then at the state level, as I mentioned, we realized that a lot of this was being driven by the ALEC agenda, the privatization agenda. And so, honestly, I just wanted to find an organization that was already doing this work and offer my background is marketing. And so, even from day one, when my son started attending the academy at Shawnee, and I thought, one of the ways we could change this school's scores is to recruit more students from, to the magnet. So they just need some marketing. It just seems so obvious and so simple. They just need a little marketing. So I donated my time and did some marketing, and they cut me off at every turn. And it would say, "Oh, what's that?"
Who cut you off?
Mostly the superintendent, but any of her, people working for her, the principals at the time. We have high turnover in schools like that. So we were going through interim principals who were not very cooperative. Even our longer term principals that came along, we were supposed to be working to get lists so that when students didn't get into the other magnets, we could contact them and say, "Hey, you didn't get here, but you qualify here. Wouldn't you like to come out for a tour?" And, just do the typical recruiting stuff that we could have done that might have actually changed the trajectory of this school. And they would say, "Oh yeah, we're going to get you that list." And then one excuse after another would come. And then when we finally did get the list, it was after all the cutoffs, the deadlines had passed, and people had already paid their sports fees and the things that, nobody's going to change their mind 2 days before school starts or whatever. So they They pretended that they were cooperating, but they clearly weren't.
Mm-hmm.
And they would do better next year, but then next year would come and go, and still no improvement. And so they have had some tremendous success in waiting parents out. That's what they know, is eventually your kids are going to graduate. You're going to get tired. You're going to give up. And knowing that that's what they were doing to try to wait me out actually just empowered me more. So my son has graduated. He's now a junior at the Naval Academy, and I'm still doing this work because I'm mad. I'm mad now.
You said you had 2 sons, no?
I do. My oldest actually graduated from high school in New Jersey before we moved down here.
I see. Yeah.
So maybe we should move to the...
Yeah, I mean, I just want to if you can just expand on one point you had made. You said that they were busing out students out of the county to different school districts. Is that what you said? Or different schools that were outside of their neighborhood potentially?
Different schools outside of their neighborhood.
Mm-hmm. And
we are a very large district.
And what demographics are you?
We have 100,000 students in our district. It's a very large county.
What demographics are you mostly speaking about that they would bus out students?
So the demographics of our district is, I think we are a minority-majority district at about 50-50. But the number of students that were being bused from their community were 80 to 90% African American, high poverty.
Yeah. And of course, a school district would never outright say that we're going to move African American families, right? But how would you say that the language around trying to bus children out of a neighborhood school, or trying to almost segregate, it seems, this is what it is, it seems like what you're alluding to. How would you say the language around that was formed to bus children out?
Well, it was a plan to desegregate our schools.
Yeah,
absolutely. There's no question, and the motive behind it is applause-worthy. We love having desegregated schools. Don't get me wrong.
Right.
But when I became aware that the entire burden of desegregation was placed on this one segment of our community, that's when I realized that we had a problem. Busing should go both ways.
Right.
There should be just as many people being bused from east to west as there are from west to east, and that's where I started trying to raise some awareness in my community. But to answer your question, we actually did use race and race alone as our factor for determining what schools students were assigned to.
All right.
And that made it to the Supreme Court.
Mm-hmm.
So in a landmark decision, we were told that we could not use race and race alone as a factor. So we ended up using 3 criteria, and that includes the educational attainment level of parents and income in addition to race. And race is really determined by a zip code. So we're not actually looking at an application and saying this person is African American, right, therefore they're being assigned here. They're taking a segment of the neighborhood, and census data tells them that is a 80% tract of African Americans. So everyone in that neighborhood actually gets bused, including the 20% whites. But it's still the way our housing is so segregated. Our schools are desegregated, sort of, and I say sort of because even though we desegregate our schools through busing, you still end up with segregation within the schools. So we have different, I think it's called tracking sometimes. Mm-hmm. It's not intentional tracking, but basically students have certain expectations when they come to certain schools, and those students who are bused in kind of are set on one course, and the students who live in those neighborhoods are set on another course. And so oftentimes they're in different hallways and different floors of the building, different lunches, maybe same lunch, but that they don't always commingle in the school.
So my understanding is, like you said, it's not the issue of desegregation, it's that the burden of desegregation is falling on the most vulnerable families who need to be consulted most about whether this will help you or not.
Correct.
And if it does help them, good. But
absolutely,
if it doesn't help them, then they should be the first in the line to get the assignment that they want, not be last in line.
Correct. They should have every opportunity that my son has living in the east part of Louisville. We live in a yellow block in this map, and there's a black dot right in the middle of the yellow block. So before he does anything, he has the default option of attending a school in his neighborhood. And if he wants to apply around the district, he can certainly do so. If you live in the West End, before you've done anything, you've been bussed out. There's a checkerboard of color blocks, and depending on the color block of the block that you live in, you may be bused to a school in the Southwest. You may be bused to a school in the East. You may be bused. There's 12 different high schools. This is the high school map. There's 12 different high schools that they could be bused to. So they also lose that sense of community and their ability to advocate and have agency because their neighbors don't even attend the same school as they do. So they're not even getting the same communications and the same opportunities to push back when there's an injustice.
Right, and I think this is getting us into an area I didn't know we were going to get into, but I think it is an important area now. The fact that you talk about the attempt to desegregate in this way where the burden falls on the people who are most vulnerable does create another situation that those schools that they're desegregated into, which aren't really prepared for it, basically you essentially segregate the students within that on honors classes and AP classes looks one way, and more remedial classes look another way. So you separate the students within the school, creating divisions within the school itself because you haven't prepared the school on how to essentially heterogeneously bring everyone forward together.
Mm-hmm. Yes. We also deal with cultural incompetence through some of our staff and teachers who may not recognize a certain bias that they have, and a certain behavior may be considered disruptive based on the color of the skin of the student that's performing that behavior. And so we have about a 5-to-1 ratio of students of color that are suspended or given behavioral detentions of
and expulsions and things like
that. And I think that
don't expel. We have alternative schools for students that.
I see.
Oh,
yes.
And I think that this is augmented with the lack in funding for early childhood education, and with no professional development money for educators. I was just reading before coming, and as well as the defunding of resources for community centers for youth as well, no? Which is just creating this, is just feeding into this.
Absolutely. Yeah. We've had cuts. Well, our class sizes are getting bigger. We have less and less mental health counselors, guidance counselors. We end up with more police officers because we're making these cuts on the front end, like you said, early childhood, and things where the investment would pay for themselves are being cut so that we end up with more reactive, punitive measures on the back end, which may be less expensive in the short term, but they're a lot more expensive in the long term.
Exactly.
And I want to point out another group that's not often talked about in education, paraprofessionals, who play that role of supporting teachers, helping them reach those students that that are falling through the cracks. Mm-hmm. Because it's a difficult thing to get everyone moving forward. You need additional adults who can kind of help those students and advocate for those students in the classroom. And those people are vastly underpaid, and those positions are all being lost in schools as well.
Yes.
Nevertheless, I do want to talk about what the current struggle that, as I understand, you're involved in, that has led to these kind of sick outs and strikes that are going on in Kentucky. I know a little about them, but can you tell us more about what has been going on there, how you've been involved in it, and so forth?
Yeah, we just came off the end of our most recent session. As I mentioned, we ended up with 6 days where school was canceled due to sick outs. I think we're still trying to process exactly what happened. The media distorts the truth, and opportunists sometimes either take the credit, if you want to call it credit, or place the blame and spread misinformation about what's really happening. But it's been a real whirlwind for the last 3 sessions, because 2017 is when we first realized that the ALEC legislation was coming, and we had 7 really bad bills passed that first week of session in 2017. Right to work passed, prevailing wage passed, and we knew that charter schools had been proposed, but it actually didn't pass until the very last day of session that first year. And they weren't able to get a funding mechanism. So that was a win. That was a major win. They didn't pass scholarship tax credits. We slowed them down. And there weren't sick outs that year, but there was a strong presence in Frankfort. We had volunteers and teachers and retired teachers that were steady presence in our capital.
Can I ask you to say a little bit more about, say, what the right to work stuff and the prevailing wage were, just a little bit about them before you move on?
Sure. So right to work is essentially an attempt to undermine unions. And our governor has made it clear he wants to break the backs of the unions here in Kentucky. And so that was one of their first agendas, was to pass the right to work legislation that has been written by ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. And prevailing wage is another measure that is anti-labor, which makes us less competitive in our wages. We are on the river. We've got Indiana across the river. So it undermines our ability to pay our laborers a fair wage, because we're now competing with the wages that have already been undermined in Indiana, for example.
Okay, right.
So,
very quickly, you mentioned that the right to work was also you said funded by ALEC, you said?
It's written by ALEC.
Written by ALEC, excuse me. And ALEC, I think, would be funded, would you know, funded by what organizations behind ALEC? I think you mentioned a few. Can you just quickly say, because they're the behind the curtains people that are moving this, and if you can just quickly say who is funding ALEC?
Yes, ALEC is a brainchild of the Koch brothers for the most part, but it does have a number of corporations. I think Walmart and Gates Foundation and many other corporations have been working behind the scenes to fund the American Legislative Exchange Council. I think Betsy DeVos and that whole cabal as well.
Thank you. We just wanted to follow the breadcrumbs to where this is all leading. Yeah.
So then this attack starts again, or a renewed attack starts at 2017. Why now, 2 years later, are teachers, starting to act? What's going on that's causing educators to start to take action and fight back?
Well, the biggest mobilizer for our teachers was the threats to their pension. There was pension reform legislation, again, written by ALEC. If you go to their website, they actually call it the pension promise, and then that was the same language that was introduced here in Kentucky, was this pension promise. But if you looked at the actual legislation, it was designed to take our teachers off of pensions and put them on 401k type programs. And our teachers here in Kentucky don't get Social Security.
Wow.
So the pension is their only retirement plan. And as the session went on and more shenanigans were happening and more waiving of rules, and we just learned that we couldn't trust our legislators to be looking out for teachers' best interests. And as a parent, that concerned me, because our teachers deserve their promises to be kept. The money in their pensions actually came out of their paycheck. It's not an entitlement program or some kind of welfare. It's actually money that came out of their paychecks and should have been invested properly, but it turns out they were kicking the can down the road and funding special pet projects because they had this surplus of money at the time that they could do this with, and year after year after year. This is not a new problem. This is not a problem that our current legislators are responsible for creating, but they are responsible for finding a solution. And we have the ability to raise new revenue. We have the ability to close corporate tax loopholes, but instead of looking at those options, they just wanted to destroy the pensions for teachers and break the backs of unions and do these things that are really part of this privatization agenda that you've seen play out across the country. Yeah. And so when we recognized that that's what was happening, Our organization, Save Our Schools Kentucky, did a lot of legwork in educating teachers and community members that this is part of charter schools and pensions. This is all related to this privatization agenda that's been funded and fueled and underwritten by Alec and the Koch brothers. And so when some really questionable things started happening, and they even passed a bill in the dark of night on the last day of session called the sewer bill. They actually took a bill that was written for wastewater, stripped it of its contents, took the pension bill that nobody could stomach because it hadn't passed the entire session. They couldn't get it out of committee. They stuck it in a bill that was written for another purpose and passed it at the 11th hour on the last day of session. And so we called that the sewer bill. And so those are the kinds of things that got teachers mobilized last year. And that bill was actually found unconstitutional and thrown out. So then when this session started, right away they were trying to get that bill back into play. And there was no stomach for it, luckily, because teachers were showing up. Last year the narrative was more about pay and pensions, and even though our organization really wanted to keep the focus on anti-privatization and protecting public education and protecting our public schools and protecting our democracy, because that, as a taxpayer and a parent, that's where my interests lie. That's where my concern came in. But knowing that if you destroy the pensions and underpay our teachers, you deprofessionalize the profession, and teachers will leave, and schools will suffer, and students will suffer. So the way I looked at it when it was pay and pensions that mobilized teachers to really get into the fight, it was because teachers take a lot of beatings. They take a lot of abuse from administration, from the legislators, from the community, whomever. They know that the work they are doing is sacred, and they continue to do that work regardless of the abuses that are thrown at them. When their pay is threatened and when their pensions are threatened, and they realize for the first time they may actually have to choose another profession, they realize that leaves those students vulnerable. Who will defend them? Who will protect them? Who will fight for them? Who will be there for them every day to build those relationships and console them through their traumas and all those other things? And so the community kind of picked up on that being about pay and teachers are selfish and all this kind of stuff, but it really wasn't. It was more, it's an abusive relationship, really. The teachers stay for the kids, kind of like what you say with the family, an abusive situation in a family. They stay for the kids. And when pay was threatened to the point where they realized that they were going to be forced to make choices, difficult decisions, that's when they showed up and fought. And this year, what I find is a continuation of what happened last year, but more along the lines of, okay, we've got pension put to bed. They haven't been able to get the pension bill out. It was not moving. We knew it was a short session. We knew it wasn't moving, but yet we still had teachers showing up in Frankfort. And it was because it was the war on education. There was a bill specifically designed to take parent and teacher voice away from the site-based decision making, and that was a bill that got us our second sick out was because Senate Bill 250 was moving, and that bill targeted Jefferson County in particular, and so we started seeing teachers come to Frankfort to stop really anything tied to this privatization agenda, anything tied to deprofessionalizing, and really just stopping it in its tracks. And so there was a 14-day break, and then they come back for the very last day for sine die, and there was a lot of buildup. Are they going to call in sick? Are they not going to call in sick? I kind of am of the thinking that when you start something, you finish it. Mm-hmm. And when they called for the first sick out, that it was a group called Kentucky 120, which was a group that popped up last year, kind of spun off of Save Our Schools Kentucky. The woman who formed it was in our legislative organization. She was part of our decision-making body. And when the pension became the major threat, they went and they copied what has happened in other states, which is great. This is what we need to do, is look at what's happening in other states and emulate that. And so they formed Kentucky 120 United, because we have 120 counties, and they built a structure and a way to mobilize, and social media was a big part of that. But somewhere along the lines last year, they got off message and they no longer were willing to fight. And it kind of felt like something had happened. Something had gotten a hold of them, of their leadership, and really caused them to align more with union leaders who were saying, stop all this activism, and really kind of watered it down. And this year, the same thing. They called for the first sick out, and if you ask me, it was premature. Groups were still mobilizing. Vulnerable populations were still mobilizing. The bill that they decided to go to Frankfurt for, that was the first bill that triggered a sick out, was a bill that was tied to pensions, that would have allowed the governor to appoint the trustees that oversee the pension. So it's not a good bill. It was a terrible bill. But it was only in committee. It really hadn't gained any traction yet. And so the decision to call for a strike when there was still a month left of session, to choose that day to go, caught a lot of people off guard. And then when they announced it, they said, if we go, it was a Thursday, if we go on a Thursday, we're staying Thursday and Friday, and then we'll decide what to do from there. Well, Thursday came, the bill passed out of committee anyway, even though we were all there, and they said, okay, everybody go back to work. And the people who had said, wait a minute, you said Thursday, Friday, we got to at least keep our word, because now they know we're weak if we don't, if we're going to do one thing and do something else. And then on top of that, people of color, teachers of color, teachers who work with students of color, who work with our vulnerable, our special needs, our alternative students, etc. When the 120 group decided to retreat, it's kind of like we charged the hill, and certain populations who maybe have privilege, who are going to be okay regardless of what happens, decided, oops, let's retreat. But in the meantime, they've put their more vulnerable populations on those front lines now, and they're the ones that are now saying, we're here, let's finish this. Right. And so that's where we first saw that divide among the different groups. And then there became a lot of backbiting and finger pointing, and who's calling for the sick out, and who do you think you are, telling our teachers what to do. And I'm a parent, I'm a cheerleader. Our teachers are smart, our teachers are adults. If there's a teacher that's actually doing something because I told them to, I'm apparently a lot more powerful than I realize. But I'm really just cheering them on. They're the ones coming to us, coming to our organization because we exist, and because 120 and these other organizations, their union leaders themselves, are shutting them out and not listening to their concerns. So they're finding support in our organization. And when we amplify their voices and protect their names and faces, it may look like me, a parent, making these calls, but I've got 10 people talking to me who are saying, this is what we need to do, this is what we need to do. And then more people coming in through the grassroots, because we have leaders in our organization that are teachers and that are experienced organizers and that are working with these vulnerable populations, and their voices deserve to be represented and heard. And if their union leaders aren't going to do it, then they find another outlet. And then when 120, because it's a statewide organization, the concerns that face Jefferson County are not going to be the same concerns that face the rest of the state. And so when last year, one of the bills that we wanted to fight was the gang violence bill. It was a bill that would target our students. It wasn't specifically a race-based bill, but it simply said any gathering of 3 or more students can be subject to search and frisk, that kind of thing. And you're considered a gang if you're 3 or more students in the same space. And so it may not say students of color, but we know how those laws are executed.
There was a similar thing, Prop 21 here in California, that had a similar kind of language.
Yeah, and in our district where we see that students of color are disciplined and dealt with 4 or 5 times higher numbers than their white counterparts, we see this as problematic. And so we wanted to fight that bill. We said, we were in Frankfurt anyway. These were days when we were already striking and rallies were being held. And I went in and said, we've got 2 more days of session. This was last year. We had 2 more days of session. We've been there the first 58 days. We're coming back for the last 2. Why wouldn't we be back the last 2? And this wasn't due to strikes. It was simply our organization had a presence there. And 120 told us, no, we've lost. It's over. Focus on flipping the House. And I'm like, no, we have gang violence bill. And I mentioned the gang violence bill in particular in one of their chat groups, and I got kicked out for it. I got kicked out for bringing up a bill that was going to target our GAP students, which in Jefferson County, we're facing a state takeover because we don't adequately educate our students that fall into this definition of the GAP. Yeah. So for us to ignore things that target and discriminate against our GAP students and be held accountable for closing achievement gaps, those are 2 concepts that you have to have them both work hand in glove. And so when we brought this up in some of these groups, we got kicked out. We got accused of calling people names. I said it's a racist bill, and maybe because they heard me say that, they thought I was calling them a racist. I never called anyone a racist, but that's how people hear it. And then we were accused of being divisive. And when you
say we, you're talking about your organization, Dear JCPS, yes.
And Save Our Schools Kentucky. We were at the state level as well.
Right.
And those accusations were coming from both politicians, but also union leaders.
Correct. And organizations that appear to be grassroots, but later seem to be compromised in their loyalty to the union leadership. And
how do you understand why they're doing? I probably have some ideas in my own mind as I'm listening, but what's your understanding of why they're doing this?
Why
they're being so critical of groups like you and trying to push back so hard on people who are trying to fight?
So I have lots of theories, I suppose. One is that these are union leaders who have positions of power that they're very comfortable in, and they want to kind of continue status quo. They don't want anyone to undermine their power. And so when a movement takes off and becomes organic and kind of uncontrollable, union leadership's power and their lack thereof becomes exposed. So I think that's part of it. I do think that they're making backroom deals.
Yeah.
I think I don't know that they're necessarily on the take, quote unquote, but we've seen evidence that our local union leader got a bill sponsored by my senator, and that bill was
being.
Her name is Julie Rocky Adams. Mm-hmm. She's my state senator, and she sponsored the bill that I mentioned earlier that would take parental and teacher voice away from the site-based decision-making, and specifically in the principal selection process, and just in Jefferson County. So only her constituents are going to be harmed by the bill that she introduced. And it's been brought to our attention that the union leader was able to get her to introduce this bill as a favor, or for whatever reason he was bragging about it behind the scenes, even though publicly they were opposed to the bill.
Right.
So they were working one angle to get favor from somebody, and then publicly, lightweight, pretending they were opposed to it. I testified against the bill, and one of the House reps that is clearly ALEC. You can't even reason with people when they are so dead set on pushing their agenda. They truly don't care about doing what's best for kids. They've got somebody pulling their puppet strings, telling them what to say and do. And it's an insane argument when you try to reason with those folks. But he had apparently been told that I had called for the sick out the day that we were all there fighting SB 250.
You have lots of power.
I know. Even though the media gave credit to one of the new pop-up groups, I think, and these pop-up groups were coming about because people were getting kicked out of KY 120.
Right.
So if they didn't want radical rogue groups to be created, maybe they should have let them stay in their organization and be part of the conversation. But by kicking people out prematurely, they're not able to really understand why we were opposed to the gang violence bill, why we were opposed to retreating on that Friday, why there are other bills that are just as important, if not more important. They accused us of spreading misinformation, and one of the bits of misinformation that we shared was that there was a bill they were going to take. There was a scholarship tax credit bill and a pension bill, and both of them had been looming, but we were told they were dead because they were trying to get teachers to stop their work stoppages. But then there was a rumor, and this, again, you cannot trust these people. Remember the sewer bill. There was a rumor that they were taking a pension bill and a scholarship tax credit bill and putting it into some kind of hybrid bill, and we'd be seeing that in the next few days. And so then there was another sick out. Well, they said that was all misinformation because, see, look, that bill never came out. Well, maybe that bill never came out because there was another sick out. Right. So I think we did stop and slow a lot of horrible things from happening, but there was a lot more we could have done. And in fact, speaking of my senator, the very last day when we should have gone back, in my opinion, there was
gone back to
Frankfurt,
right,
to sick out one last time, but because the district and the union leaders made a deal, they said, we won't. Instead of sicking out, we're going to send 500 delegates. So we got to let people sign up. Teachers from across the district got to sign up to be the delegates that would go to Frankfurt on that last day. Well, our commissioner had already asked for names of the teachers that had called in sick previously, so they knew they were targeted. So, of course, they're going to take a compromise deal because they don't want to have more scrutiny and more threats of retaliation or punishment because they called in sick. So it really watered down the last day. And even though the district could send 500 delegates, we think there were closer to 300 that went. So I don't even know why they weren't able to get their full 500. And again, it's going to be schools that have the excess staff and the excess resources where they can send delegates. So these are not going to be your vulnerable populations or people who are going to speak up on behalf of vulnerable populations. They're going to be mainstream teachers who, maybe don't realize why they're even there. And so that's what I kind of ran into that last day. The Senate gavels in at noon, and there were okay, you remember I told you about the Kentucky Board of Education appointments that our governor had made, and how they were all pro-privatization, all pro-charter. No public school advocates have been appointed to our Kentucky Board of Education, which is frightening. Mm-hmm. And the Senate has to confirm them every year. So even though they were appointed in April of last year, they had not even been confirmed, and they had even named a new commissioner, and they've been operating as if they have the authority to operate, but the Senate truly has to confirm them before anything is really official. So Senate resolutions 240 through 249 were filed the very last day before the break started. So it almost looked like they weren't even going to get confirmed, which was kind of really interesting. So the Senate is more measured and more seasoned and more. They make better long-term rational decisions because they have 4-year terms and they've been in office longer usually, and there's fewer of them, whereas the House is kind of chaos all the time, chaos. Every 2 years there's new people, and so the Senate is our opportunity to really reach the decision makers and have them truly understand what they're doing and what's at stake. So we launched a campaign over the 14 days to contact our senators and encourage them not to confirm Bevan's appointments to the KBE, and pointed out that Gary Houchins in particular was one of the founding directors of an organization called Ed Choice Kentucky, and he was in a position to benefit from scholarship tax credits, and he's also been a huge critic of Jefferson County. He's also a huge proponent of choice, and he serves on the Kentucky Charter School Public Charter School Association board as well, or was on the board at one time. So there's all this evidence that there's conflict of interest, and the Senate gavel's in at noon, and I'm trying to get teachers that are there that have, signed up to be delegates to come and stand with me in the tunnels and in the pathways where the senators have to pass, so that we can convince them not to confirm these directors, Board of Education members, and they're telling me things like, we want, oh, we want to go over here. Well, great, go over there in 10 minutes. Right now, this is where we need to be. And they said, just because you think that's where we need to be doesn't mean that's where we think. Like, they were arguing with me. And I've been there almost every day for the last 3 years, walking and talking with these senators, building relationships, holding signs. This is what we do. I know this. This is what we do. And they were arguing with me. And so what happened, which is really interesting, is the Senate pulled down resolutions 241 through 249 and passed them, which means they held on to 240. So I'm running back and trying to figure out which one is 240. It's the Gary Houchins one. It's the guy. It's the guy we're trying to stop. So we actually got through to them. They pulled it off consent, and they were actually going to debate it on the floor. So now this is our chance. Get on the phones, email, get your signs, go stand in strategic places. Again, I can't find teachers to save my life. There's about 12 of us standing on the stairs trying to talk to legislators as they're going back up to vote on it the second time. And my senator, her name is Rocky Adams, so she's in the R's, Julie Rocky Adams. I'm watching the count. They pull Senate Resolution 240 to the floor to debate it. There's a really powerful debate. There's all this evidence as to why we shouldn't vote and confirm this man. Because, again, we're facing a state takeover. The commissioner that they appointed wants to take over our district. If we can derail the Kentucky Board of Education appointees, it essentially derails their ability to take over our district. It's a checkmate play. Mm-hmm. And the votes are coming in. It's tied, up one, down one. We're actually up one a couple of times. This never happens. We only have 9 Democratic senators out of 38. We're never tied. This is unprecedented. My senator decides she needs to go to the bathroom, I guess. So she leaves the room. And counts tied, the counts up one, down one. We're getting to the last 3 or 4. And the last 3 or 4 are all Republicans, so you know how it's going to go. And she comes back in, and I can see her, but she's off camera. I just happen to see her in the gallery, and I can see her, and she gives the thumbs up to somebody in the front of the room. And I'm thinking, that just means she's ready to cast her vote. No, it gives her a green Y. Right there, it goes from 17, 18 to 19.
So she voted for the dude.
She voted for the dude. My senator voted for the man who's going to push this state takeover all the way through. And my union leaders are sitting in the gallery to my right, and I look at them and I said, "Your girl," because they endorsed her and got her to sponsor that other bill and all this other stuff. And I said, "Your girl just lost it for us." And they were like, "We see, thanks," So I'm thinking, either she played them or they're in on it. I don't know. We'll see. I think she played them. I think she's really that good. But it just frustrated me because we got so close to stopping that one thing from happening. And if we had been more organized and more mobilized, we got senators who voted against this who never vote with us on anything. And they were trusting that, we really need to do something different. We're hearing from all of you that this is the thing that needs to be done. And so they were listening, and a little bit more public pressure that day absolutely could have stopped it. I have no question in my mind. So those are the kinds of things that happened that, yes, our presence made a difference. I really do think that if we hadn't been there those other 6 days, we would have ended up with scholarship tax credits and the pension reform and all the other things that we were there to prevent. But if we hadn't fizzled and hadn't had union leaders yelling at the cheerleaders and yelling at their members, there's actually a video of the 120 officer that is yelling at Jefferson County in particular. And she's telling us we're not special and who do we think we are. And,
send us a link.
What's that? Yeah, I will. Because we were willing to stick out even when the rest of the state wasn't. Because we have different issues. And that bill, Senate Bill 250, specifically targeted Jefferson County. How do you expect the entire state to stick out over a bill that affects just Jefferson County? But the thing is the size of our district, once we're taken over, they're coming for you next. It's in the state's best interest to support us and help us avoid these attacks, but they don't see it yet. And there's also a lot of resentment because we also have our funding. We have what's called SEEK funding, SEEK, and it was a result of CARA, which is our Education Reform Act that was passed in 1990, because we weren't properly funding our schools. And the state Supreme Court said that we needed to more adequately distribute funds to our rural districts. So the money from taxpayers all goes into a state pot, and then it's distributed on a per pupil allocation across the state. So Jefferson County, being a larger tax-paying community, contributes more than its share to this pot of money. And so, again, if our district ends up filing bankruptcy, that SEEK money will be hurt. Our rural communities will feel the pain from that. And a lot of what we see happening in Jefferson County and across the state, but in Jefferson County in particular, does feel like what I understand is what they tried to do in Kansas, or what they did do in Kansas. They pushed the costs down because states can't file bankruptcy. So instead of funding education and municipal services and pensions, they shortchange them. Those costs get pushed down to the local level, so districts end up filing bankruptcy. When a district files bankruptcy, they can come in and turn those dollars into charter schools and privatize the schools, but also it allows them to destroy the unions. So we're fighting to protect against privatization, to protect the strength of our unions, and so it makes absolutely no sense to us why union leaders would be yelling at us for cheerleading and fighting for these same things. It blows my mind. So,
yeah, I mean, I don't think I personally, just hearing the story, knowing what I know of what happened in Oakland and LA and all around the country, I do think that your union leadership made a backdoor deal. Like they got some sort of agreement in relationship to pensions, preserving that, and understood that we're going to give you this, so you have to give us that, and that stuff was all done offline. A very similar thing happened in Oakland around their strike, where essentially the union leadership in Oakland had reached an agreement with the board of ed in Oakland that we'll give you your wage increase. We're going to get some class size cuts, we're going to reduce class sizes and things like that to some extent. But you're going to have to let us make some cuts to paraprofessionals, make some cuts to student services. That's how we're going to fund your waging. So that's what they do. They are not engaged in class struggle. They're engaged in horse trading to help politicians, make their bones off of what is essentially a dual project for both Republicans and Democrats to privatize education. Because there's big money being $800 billion nationwide in education. The corporations want a piece of that action. And
Absolutely.
And they pay both sides. So I'm just, and particularly hearing that you had the forces there on the ground to try to pressure them and to try to embarrass them and shame them into doing what's right because you were trying to expose it to the light of day, and the union said, don't do that. Let's go over here and be away from that. That's just, they're not that dumb. I mean, they're dumb, but they're dumb in a different way.
Yeah. It's definitely a distractive, diversionary tactic.
Right.
And, you know, we're fighting these AstroTurf groups, and it almost feels like these allied groups are more AstroTurf. You know, they're not cheering on their members. They're yelling at their members. They're acting more like the oppressors than they are lifting up the voices of those who need to be represented. And they're also tone deaf when it comes to cultural awareness. And so whenever race gets brought into the equation, they quickly change the subject, or they accept deals that benefit the mainstream, which again leaves our teachers and students of color picking up the tab. And a perfect example is when we were trying to get the budget bill passed last year. It had lots of cuts in it, cuts to education, etc. And in order, you know, we pushed back, don't cut this, don't cut that. We pushed back on some things. And so then they said, okay, fine, we'll just do a tax, you know, sales tax increase instead. And then the union was like, yes. And then they did a veto override, and they really got behind. And in fact, they threw our good legislators under the bus because the legislators who were opposed to the bad budget bill in the first place still voted against it when it was time to override the veto. But my senator and some of the other Republicans that had been playing both sides came out and did the override of the veto. So they got to get green check marks next to their name, where the legislators who had been allies all along got red X's. And it's just that convoluted mixed messaging that the union union leadership kind of tends to do to keep everyone confused and make them think that they're doing the right thing when in fact they did the wrong thing. But that budget bill with the increased sales tax hurts our families that live paycheck to paycheck. So it may have gotten their pet project that people were pushing back on funded, but at the expense of, again, those who have the least agency and feel the repercussions every time we make a bad deal.
I have a question for you, Gay. You are in a red state.
Yes.
What is the sentiment? What is the vibe? What is the energy like for teachers in a red state? Are they normally progressive or liberal, or are they in unison wherever on the spectrum you are when it comes to strikes?
We are a very conservative state. Even in, yes, we are a red state. Louisville and Lexington are both blue. So we are two little blue islands in a sea of red. But even in our blue communities, our teachers are still very conservative. Our teachers are paid well. So they're not striking over pay. It takes a lot to really get them willing to put their jobs at risk. And many of them teach in schools that don't experience the extreme poverty and the detrimental effects, or aren't targets for charter schools. And so they don't really truly see the threat. And so it takes a lot to get teachers mobilized to where at one point we had 2,000 teachers in Jefferson County calling in sick, and that's a third of our teachers. Mm-hmm. So that was evidence that they're starting to see that this is a really sinister plot. Mm-hmm. And that's what I think it takes, is moving people from crazy conspiracy theory sounding rhetoric, which is what it is. It sounds like conspiracy theory rhetoric because it's really that crazy of a concocted plan that the first time I meet anybody and I tell them what we're fighting, I sound like a loon. And I recognize that. Yeah. But I've been sounding like a loon for about 6 years. And
so you've gotten used to it.
Well, and the things that I sounded loony about 6 years ago turned out to be true. Exactly. So if you go back and watch some of my earlier videos, you'll see, oh man, we better listen to her. But no, I mean, we've done the research and we've seen it. It's seeing your video when you showed up in Oakland. When you showed up in Oakland, coming from the Bay Area on the 6th day of the strike, and you said what you said, and I just happened to be like a kid I thought about this. I felt like a kid on a summer night clicking around AM radio stations. You know, I don't know what I'm looking for. I'm looking for aliens, right?
Found that.
And then I come across this video, and you're talking about how union leaders are not honest, and they're spreading misinformation, and the motive as to why, and the things another thing that you said that really resonated was because they were pushing back, the state was going to come down on them harder, so that's why other communities needed to come out. Well, we just saw that happen. We just saw our commissioner ask for names of teachers. Like, where do we live where our commissioner is threatening our teachers? And then even our legislators are saying that was an illegal strike. And this is a legislator who was endorsed by the union. And like, there's just this really confusing mixed message. And when I heard your video, I realized that, you know, we come to our conclusions organically. The work that we're doing here in Jefferson County, for the most part, just evolved. It evolved organically. You get a threat, you react. You see an opening, you respond. You have a suspicion that something doesn't make sense, and you investigate it further. You expose that, you rip off that Band-Aid, something else opens up. You just keep doing the next right thing. And to come across a video from somebody I've never met before, who we were on our 6th day of our sick out when I found the video of you on their 6th day, and it just reaffirms that everything we're doing, everything we know, everything that our gut tells us is right, and the steps that we're taking to fight it can and must be done. We must stop what is happening because it is a threat to our democracy. It is a threat to our communities. It is a threat to the future of our youth. There are so many things at stake, and we're not imagining it because we have all these other states and districts to look at and see where you are in this process. And relatively speaking, Kentucky is very early in this process. We are very young in the evolution, and because of that, we have such a great opportunity to stop it before it starts. Yeah. Because you see people waking up. You see people realizing that Betsy DeVos does not have a clue what she's doing. And that agenda is what has been crammed down the throats of districts across the entire country. And I mentioned it as we were warming up earlier, there's a Mark Twain quote that says, "When I die, I want to be in Kentucky because everything happens 25 years later there."
I love it.
You are going to want to cut that out. You're going to want to edit that comment. Your Kentucky natives are going to really be upset with you.
Oh, no, they love that quote too. We're kind of laid back here, and that's okay. But it's been a blessing when it comes to the privatization of our public schools, because all these other states have led the way, and it's been long and drawn out and painful and death by 1,000 cuts. And when they arrived in Kentucky, they thought we were stupid. They thought they could pull one over on us. They thought they could just ram it all through, and boy, did we have a surprise for them. So being 25 years behind could be the saving grace that we have to where we can stop this once and for all, and have an opportunity to actually just bypass all the other states that are struggling and suffering from the harm that's been done.
Well, one of the states that's ahead of you is California, a blue state, I will just say, right? And we have been. I mean, sometimes it's been places like Hurricane Katrina comes in and hits New Orleans, and they use it to decimate it and bring up charter schools. It's disaster capitalism kind of stuff, right? But for the slow process, they've been doing it here in California. So all these things you're talking about, the racism, the attacks on the so the failed schools and things like that as the basis for charterizing them. That's all been play tested in our state and is being brought to you. We haven't had the kind of fight until recently. In fact, Oakland was the first one to at least raise the charter school stuff. But again, our Democratic governor who was this guy? Tony Thurmond, wasn't the governor, puts together essentially, and he's supposedly a friend of the unions, and he puts together a completely pro-charter board to oversee this study about the charterization of schools in California. So this is something that might be coming late in Kentucky, but we have advanced work on it here in California.
Yes. Go ahead.
Yeah, wouldn't you say as well, though, that strikes are contagious, no? Like they're viral. And the recent red strikes from was like a domino effect happening. And I think that this is what we here at What's Left are really pointing to, this momentum in our time at this moment in time, where we are seeing Uber strikes in Los Angeles, and where we're seeing strikes happening up in New Jersey, and we're seeing strikes happen here in our city, in San Francisco here. And teacher strikes they're in that professional middle class fine line where they are either considered working class amongst them, or they're considered the middle class, because they have had to get some higher education to be able to get their jobs, no? But what I'm trying to say is, it seems to me that that you said Kentucky is slow, but would you say that it is also maybe some of the effect of this red strike wave that happened was also a contribution to the strikes and the continuous strikes that you all continue to have in Kentucky?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think it's because we can relate to our neighbors.
Mm-hmm.
West Virginia is on our border. Our Eastern Kentucky border is right up there. So we've got some pretty progressive folks out in Eastern Kentucky that are also mobilizing and ready to take action. We can find parallels in what's happening in these other red states and relate and identify. Absolutely. I also think that something that's special that's happening is that this is a labor movement, but it's also a women's movement, because the teaching profession is mostly female.
Uh-huh.
And we're seeing teachers of color and students of color and social justice coming into the conversation. So this is also a civil rights movement. So to me, what I'm seeing happen, and I wish there was more of it in Kentucky, we're getting there, especially in our urban centers. But to me, this is a perfect storm. It's a perfect storm of a labor movement, a women's movement, and a civil rights movement coming together. And that's why I think this time it's different.
Mm-hmm. And now, to me, it looks like your union leaders are pulling up the tent stakes on the struggle in Kentucky for the most part. And okay, if you were to be able to actually give real advice to people who were interested in making a real struggle, what would you say needs to happen now?
We have to focus on district-specific issues. We're no longer in our session unless a special session arises. We have to recognize that this is a marathon, not a sprint. We need to be organizing and mobilizing and building a base so that we find that common ground for when the next threat comes, but also start thinking more proactively. We can't constantly be reacting. We need to have demands. I think you asked earlier in one of the questions about demands. I don't think we even have our list of demands. Because our union leaders are making backroom deals and compromises, we need to also identify who our negotiators are going to be, because we can't count on union leaders to do the negotiating. So I think steps include taking back those unions, getting people to run for those offices that are willing to fight and that are willing to represent and listen to rank and file members. I think continuing to mobilize people to elect candidates from both sides of the aisle who are public education friendly. We've got a lot of tactical things that need to take place, and I kind of use the sandbag analogy. They're all important. We have to put sandbags around our home, or we're going to get flooded. And every single one of those sandbags is critical, because if you just miss one, the whole thing still floods. So we're playing chess, and we're getting better, I think, at recognizing their next moves. That's been a big piece of it, is we've been so busy reacting and swatting the flies that we couldn't really anticipate the next moves. But even this close call where we almost stopped Gary Houchins from getting confirmed, we saw that move. We actually saw it before it happened. Being able to have a communication strategy so that everybody can get on the same page and minimize confusion and minimize misinformation is going to be a critical piece moving forward. And so helping people recognize who you can trust and who you can't is part of that as well.
Well, you quoted Mark Twain, but I don't know who first said this, but there's a really important union slogan that people think is like a moral one, but it's not. It's a political one. The idea that an injury to one is an injury to all. And when unions have been basically being etched away, we have seen that our working conditions, our living conditions etched away under the idea of, well, we'll accept this loss to this person over here as long as we retain something over here. That whole strategy is a loser. That whole strategy is essentially a race to the bottom. And we have to get back to a union that is an injury to one, that won't leave Jefferson County on the chopping block, or won't leave kids of color on the chopping block and say we'll gain, the rest of us will gain, or the rest of us will lose less. That has to end. As long as we keep doing that, we're done.
Absolutely. And we saw something similar with pensions this last session. The very last day of session, a bill did pass that will undermine pensions for higher education and quasi, I don't remember the exact term. It's like quasi-metro government type entities, like social welfare groups, small groups. And the teachers were being told, or the union leaders were specifically saying, this does not affect teachers. So that was another reason why there wasn't a big push to get people to Frankfurt that last day. But the thing is it's still pensioners. A cut to a pension is a cut to a pension is a cut to a pension. This whole concept that some groups deserve pensions and others don't when they're all state workers or government workers, that's the kind of solidarity that's missing. We can't pick and choose which issues to have solidarity over. Right. We have to fight for each other. We have to fight for the rural counties and the urban counties. We have to fight for the small pensioners and the big pensioners, because it's all just part of a strategy to chip away. And as soon as they've carved that group off, then they're coming for you next. Exactly. And we have to be better at recognizing that and playing hardball.
Correct.
And our union leaders are the ones that are selling us out. No question.
I have a final, unless you have another question.
I want to ask the socialism question.
Go ahead, ask it.
You want to ask your question?
No, I think mine is a different question. It's more personal.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I am curious about this because I've just loved hearing everything you've had to say.
You had lots to say.
Yeah, and it's really instructive about, and I really feel like very detailed actually in giving us a sense of what's happening in Kentucky. And it is, the details change, but the overall attack is the same across the country and across the globe actually.
Yes.
I am curious because here on What's Left, we also are sending our signals out looking for aliens. And we found each other and maybe found another alien over here. We talk about capitalism, about socialism, about the working class, about revolution. about the possibilities of those sorts of things. I'm wondering, it seems like you've learned a lot out of this. Have you had thoughts about those sorts of subjects as you've engaged in this fight with, as a member of the working class, trying to help lead working class into fight? I'm just wondering what sort of conclusions or thoughts you had around those sorts of bigger issues.
That's a big question. When I first got into this work, I really just wanted to be part of the solution. I saw low-hanging fruit. I saw opportunities at my child's school. I saw opportunities at the district level to make a difference, and had no idea that I was entering into a political, cutthroat, that I would have to become versed on economics and all these things that really just do not interest me whatsoever. I had to learn how to lobby and how to read legislation, and it's not my thing. So I know that there's more that I don't know and understand than there is that I do. I've only begun to scratch the surface on a lot of this stuff, but if I'm hearing your question, what I guess my response would be is there are just certain professions, certain sectors in the U.S. economy that do not do well in capitalistic structures. And when you put profit and you put competition and other business values first, people suffer. And when you're a person like me, who's privileged, who has the luxury of living in denial that people are suffering, it's easy to say it's not my fight, walk away. I did some charity work, I did some volunteer work, I've done my part, and that's not right, because the more time I spent at my son's school and the more time I spent getting to know the students and the families and the parents and the teachers and going to funerals and being in a community that's traumatized and watching people pushed from homeless encampment to prison to drugs to family violence, job loss, the things that I would rather continue to live in my denial and my existence of denial. Wouldn't we all love to be able to just pretend these things don't exist? But the fact is they do. And the more you see it, the more you have an obligation to correct it. And it's not enough to just be, you've heard this expression too, it's not enough to just not be racist, for example. You have to be anti-racist. You have to call it out. You can't be complicit. You can't be laid back about it. You have to challenge it. You have to confront it. You have to be unapologetic and be set an example for others to do the same. And I think I'm rambling at this point, but it really kind of comes back to just this capitalistic structure is part of this privatization agenda that profits on the backs of marginalized, easily discarded members of our population. And those of us who are fortunate enough, I didn't do anything special to be born with white skin or in a family that, that was the luck of the draw. And we have an obligation to level that playing field and be allies to those who don't have the same opportunities and same circumstances. Is that where you were asking? Is that anything like what
you gave a fine answer? I appreciate it. Thank you.
And I think I will ask around that as well. What gives you hope? Okay.
I've always been one of those glass half full kind of people. So it takes a lot to really kind of discourage me. But I also think one of the things that gives me hope is seeing that we're making a difference. I see the difference that we're making. And to me, there's really only two options, to keep fighting or to surrender. And surrender is not an option. So we keep fighting.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah. Well, I just want to mention your organization for our listeners. You said it's the Dear JCPS, which is the Dear Jefferson County Public School. Yes, as well as, did you say you have
Save Our Schools?
Yes. You're a host of a radio show as well.
We have a weekly radio show. So in addition to Dear JCPS, which is district focused, we have Save Our Schools Kentucky, which is a statewide organization. And so our radio program is called Save Our Schools with Dear JCPS. So it brings in...
I see.
And so we focus on district level issues as well as state level issues. And student assignment is our next big district level issue because I mentioned the structurally racist student assignment plan. In order to avoid state takeover, our commissioner has given us a list of about 30 different things that we have to accomplish, and redoing our student assignment plan is one of those things. And so the district right now is just kind of going through the motions and rubber stamping the plan and saying, oh, yes, we held a community forum and everybody loved it. It's kind of the same thing that got us started years ago. But it's not authentic, and they're not actually going out and knocking on doors and reaching the families that are most impacted by the current student assignment plan or any changes that would be made. And so I think it's going to be time to mobilize our community and start showing up and picketing, and maybe another sick out at the district level for, and maybe it's a student led, maybe it's parent led, maybe it's an opt out movement. Maybe we have students who don't appreciate what's being done to their peers and their classmates to punish them for poor test scores. So maybe there will be a social justice movement that says, we're not going to take these tests the last week of May.
Yep.
Thank you.
So,
well, Gay, I really appreciate you taking the time to give us all this information and to share this stuff. And it's actually great to meet you finally, face to face. Well,
yeah.
Well, at least video to video or something.
Digitally.
Right.
For our listeners, we just spoke with Gay Adelmann, parent/activist, and again, part of our organization, Dear JCPS, Jefferson County Public Schools, and as well as Friends of JCPS, correct?
Yes.
And please give us this link so that we can post them as well in our show notes. Yes, please subscribe, rate, review, and best of all, share with other friends and family listeners. Thank you very much, Gay, for being here with us. You have given us a very unique perspective and a window, really, to some of the strikes that have been happening on the other side of this country, of the USA. It's just very insightful, really giving us a lot of information.
And it's exciting to me to see that in the same way that I've been arguing that we as workers within our union have to be independent, the community that's going to support us in that struggle needs to be independent as well. And it cannot be relying on people above telling them, oh, do this, do that, because, it's just, all of us together have to do this, but we can't fall. Well, I don't know. It's exciting to meet somebody who's clearly got that message that I'm going to do what I think is right, not what you tell me is expedient or practical.
And what is just amazing for me is that your investment into the community, into your county, into the school district is just, you know, it's like your civil duty is being, you're called for, you're fulfilling this. And so I am just in admiration to it. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
All right. So we'll discuss maybe what we're going to do next week. Maybe Algeria, maybe something around immigration, because my friends have come back from the border.
Yes.
You know, and want to talk about their experience in the refugee crisis.
So that'll be next.
So let's see.
So we'll let you go. Thank you so much, Gay.
And we'll see everyone next week.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.